Right now, this may be one of the most influential countries on Earth. Its companies built the screen you are most likely reading this on. Its music fills stadiums on 6 continents. Its films and television series stream into more than 90 countries at the same time. It is the world's 13th largest economy. 60 years ago, it was poorer than Ghana. And right now, this same country is quietly disappearing. It has the lowest birth rate ever recorded for a nation at peace. In 2023, the average woman here was expected to have just 0.72 children in her lifetime. Not 2, not 1, less than 1. The number needed simply to hold a population steady is 2.1. This country is at a third of that. So both facts sit side by side. A nation at the height of its power, admired and copied around the world. And a nation whose own government projects it will lose nearly a third of its people within 50 years, falling from 52 million toward 36. The world has learned to love this place from the outside. Its songs, its dramas, its phones, its food. We feel like we know it. But the country behind those exports is harder to see. And the story of how it rose this fast and why it may now be choosing not to continue is, in the end, the same story. How does a country win everything and still feel like it is running out of time? The answer begins not with a song or a phone, but with a river. This is South Korea. The Han River runs through the middle of Seoul, wide and slow, cutting the capital into north and south. Today, 25 million people live within reach of its banks. Glass towers crowd its edges. Bridges cross it every few minutes. At night, the water holds the reflection of one of the most wired cities on the planet. 70 years ago, this same river ran through rubble. The Korean War ended in 1953, though it did not really end. There was no peace treaty, there was an armistice, a ceasefire, a pause that has now lasted more than 70 years. The two Koreas are, on paper, still at war. What the war left behind in the south was close to nothing. The fighting had destroyed roughly 80% of the country's industry. Cities were flattened. Millions were dead or displaced. The factories and power plants were mostly in the north, on the other side of a new and sealed border. In 1960, the average South Korean earned around $80 a year. The country survived on foreign aid, most of it American. Aid made up more than 80% of the government's budget. There were almost no natural resources. There was no oil, little coal, not much arable land. By any measure that economists used at the time, this was a country with no future. And there was a memory underneath all of it, a habit older than the war. In 1907, the Korean Empire owed a vast debt to Japan, about 13 million won, close to an entire year's national budget. The loan was a kind of leash, a way to pull a weakened kingdom closer. And so, across the country, ordinary people tried to pay it off themselves. Men gave up smoking and sent the money. Women took off their wedding rings and sold them. It did not work. 3 years later, in 1910, Japan annexed Korea outright. The colony lasted 35 years. Those decades were not gentle. The Korean language was suppressed in schools. People were pressured to take Japanese names. Hundreds of thousands were conscripted into labor and into the war machine. The wound of that period still shapes the politics of the region today. There was also a darker account the colony tried to bury. As the Second World War widened, tens of thousands of young Korean women were taken into military brothels under the euphemism of comfort, a crime the survivors would spend the rest of their lives forcing the world to name honestly. It is not a footnote. It is one of the open wounds between these neighbors to this day. But the colony never owned the people the way it owned the land. On the 1st of March, 1919, the resistance broke into the open. Across the country, Koreans read aloud a Declaration of Independence and marched, unarmed, in the streets, hundreds of thousands of them, in more than 1,500 separate gatherings. The authorities answered with rifles and fire. Thousands were killed. Tens of thousands were arrested. The movement did not win independence, but the 1st of March became the day the nation pointed back to and said, "This is when we refused to disappear." The instinct was already there, the willingness to give the body itself to the idea of the country. But the instinct from 1907, the idea that when the nation is in danger, you reach into your own home and give what you have, did not disappear. Remember it. It comes back. So, in 1961, a country with no money, no resources, and a frozen war on its border did something that should not have worked. It chose to build anyway. On the 16th of May, 1961, a general named Park Chung-hee seized power in a military coup. He was not a gentle man, and the years ahead would prove it. But he had a single, total obsession: to drag this country out of poverty, fast, no matter the cost. He built what economists later called a developmental state. The government did not stand back and let the market decide. It picked winners. It directed banks to lend to chosen companies. It set export targets the way a general sets battle objectives, and it punished the firms that missed them. The first 5-year plan began, then another. Roads, ports, steel mills, chemical plants, shipyards. The strategy is simple and brutal. The country has nothing to sell the world except the work of its own people, so it will sell that. In 1962, South Korea exports about $8 million worth of goods. By 1966, that figure has passed 100 million. The economy begins to grow at nearly 10% a year, and it does not stop for 3 decades. A nation that could not feed itself in the 1950s is exporting ships and steel by the 1970s, cars and electronics by the 1980s. The newspapers give it a name: the miracle on the Han River. The speed is hard to hold in the mind. In 1970, the country opened a 400-kilometer expressway linking Seoul to Busan, end to end, built in barely 2.5 years. Whole districts of apartment towers went up in months. Seoul itself swelled from a war-gutted town into one of the densest cities on Earth within a single working lifetime. A person born in the rubble of 1953 could stand, before they had even retired, on the same ground, now buried under glass and traffic and light, and barely recognize the country they were born into. But a miracle is a word people use when they do not want to look at the cost. The growth was built on the backs of workers who labored under conditions that today would be called inhumane. 12-hour days, 14, 16. In the textile factories of Seoul, mostly young women, some of them barely more than children, worked in rooms so cramped they could not stand upright, breathing cloth dust until their lungs gave out. In November of 1970, a 22-year-old garment worker named Jeon Tae-il has had enough. He has spent years trying to get the factories to obey the country's own labor laws, laws that exist on paper and are ignored everywhere. No one will listen. So he douses himself in fuel in the middle of a Seoul market, sets himself alight, and as he burns, he shouts the words that will outlive him.
We are not machines.
He dies that night. He is one person, but the labor movement that follows him will become one of the forces that eventually cracks the dictatorship open. Park Chung-hee, the man who built the miracle, never loosens his grip. In 1972, he rewrites the Constitution to make himself effectively president for life. The secret police expand, dissidents vanish, the economy climbs, and the cage tightens at the same time, year after year, until October of 1979, when Park is shot dead at a private dinner by the head of his own intelligence service. The man who built the country is gone, and the country does not get its freedom. It gets another general. But that part of the story has to wait, because to understand what was won, you first have to understand what was made. What was made were the chaebol. The word means roughly wealthy clan. They are the family-controlled conglomerates that the government fed and protected during the boom, and they grew into something the world had not quite seen before. Samsung began as a trading company selling dried fish and noodles. Today, it is one of the largest electronics manufacturers on the planet, and on its own, it accounts for a significant slice of the entire national economy. Hyundai started in construction and car repair, LG in cosmetics and plastics. The men who ran them became legends, and the stories sound invented. Chung Ju-young, the founder of Hyundai, the son of a poor farmer who had once walked off the family land with a stolen cow to seek his fortune, set out in the early 1970s to build one of the largest shipyards in the world, on an empty stretch of beach with no yard, no ships, and no buyers. The story Koreans tell is that he won his first orders by showing foreign bankers a barren shoreline, a map, and a Korean banknote printed with a 16th century armored warship. Proof, he argued, that his people had built great vessels long before they had a shipyard. The yard got built. Hyundai became one of the largest shipbuilders on Earth. The deepest bet of all was on something almost invisible, the memory chip. In the 1980s, Samsung poured money into semiconductors it did not yet know how to make well, and kept pouring even when prices crashed and rivals retreated. The logic was cold and correct. The world would soon run on these chips, and whoever could make them most reliably, in the greatest volume, would hold everyone else by the throat. Decades later, a large share of the world's memory is made by two Korean companies. The phone in your hand almost certainly remembers things on Korean silicon. These companies did not just make products. They made apartments, hospitals, insurance, theme parks, baseball teams. A South Korean could be born in a chaebol hospital, raised in a chaebol apartment, educated on a chaebol scholarship, employed for life by the same group, and buried with a chaebol insurance policy. It produced extraordinary wealth. It also produced a strange kind of dependence. A handful of families came to hold more weight in the country than almost any institution except the state itself, and sometimes more than the state. When a chaebol heir goes on trial, the whole nation watches, because the company is, in a real sense, too large to fail. There is a phrase you hear everywhere in modern Korea: Pali Pali, hurry, hurry. It is the unofficial anthem of the place. The country that rebuilt itself in a single generation never quite slowed down, and the speed is now woven into ordinary life. This is among the most connected societies on Earth. Internet so fast and so universal that it reshaped how people shop, study, and even date. Food arrives at any hour. A package crosses the city in a morning.
It is a marvel.
And it is exhausting, and the people who live inside it know both things at once. The same impatience that poured the concrete and launched the ships now sets the metronome for everything, including how a person is supposed to live a life. Finish school, land the job, marry, buy the apartment, have the child. All of it on schedule, all of it faster than the generation before. When the schedule becomes impossible, something has to give. Hold that thought too. But the deeper engine of the miracle was never the companies. It was the children. And the bet on the children did not come from nowhere. For 5 centuries before the miracle, under the Joseon dynasty, Korea was among the most thoroughly Confucian societies on Earth. Status came not from birth alone, but from passing the civil examinations, punishing tests on the classics that could lift a family for generations or break it. The idea was already ancient here. That study is the ladder. That a child's books are the household's future. That you sacrifice the present to seat the next generation higher. The miracle simply took a 500-year-old reflex and pointed it at the modern economy. South Korea bet everything on education. A country with no resources decided that its only resource would be the trained minds of its people, and it pursued that idea harder than almost anywhere on Earth. The result, 2 generations later, is a system of relentless intensity. After the regular school day ends, most students go to Hagwon, private cram schools, and study late into the night. The lights of those academies burn past 10, past 11. Children fall asleep on the subway home. It all points toward a single morning, the Sunung, the National College Entrance Exam. On exam day, the entire country bends itself around 18-year-olds. The stock market opens late, so the roads are clear. Planes are grounded during the English listening section, so no engine noise disturbs the test. Police escort latecomers to the exam hall. For one day, a nation of 50 million arranges itself around the futures of its children. It is, in its way, a beautiful thing. It is also a pressure that does not let go. The competition that built the miracle never switches off. It follows people out of the exam hall and into the job market, into marriage, into whether they will have children at all. Hold on to that. It comes back at the end. To breathe, the country climbs into the mountains. Some 70% of South Korea is mountainous, ridge after forested ridge, and high among them, in the national park of Jirisan, something has come back from the edge. The Asiatic black bear, the moon bear, named for the pale crescent on its chest, was once nearly gone from these mountains, hunted for its gallbladder, squeezed out by logging and roads. By the 1990s, only a handful survived in the wild in the entire South. So, beginning in 2004, conservationists did something patient and unglamorous. They reintroduced bears one by one, raising cubs, releasing them, tracking them through the forest, learning where they denned and what they ate. The work took 2 decades. Today, there are dozens of moon bears living wild in Jirisan again, a small population, but a breeding one. It is a quiet kind of persistence, not the loud miracle of the skyline, but the slow return of something that was almost lost, brought back by people who would not be in a hurry, in a country that is in a hurry about everything else. But not everything came back. These same mountains once belonged to the tiger. The Siberian tiger, the largest cat on Earth, ranged across the whole Korean peninsula for thousands of years. It runs through the country's oldest story. In the founding myth, a bear and a tiger pray to become human and are told to endure 100 days in a cave, eating only mugwort and garlic. The bear endures and becomes a woman, and her son founds the Korean nation. The tiger cannot bear the dark and the hunger and leaves. Even in the myth, the bear persists, and the tiger does not. In the real mountains, the ending was the same. Hunted relentlessly during the colonial period, squeezed out by the loss of forest, the tiger vanished from the south. There has been no confirmed wild tiger here in close to a century. The moon bear was pulled back from the edge by patient hands. The tiger went over it. A country can choose to save one creature and lose another, and live with both facts at once. That patience has an older form too, kept in wood. In the mountains of the south stands Haeinsa, a temple that holds one of the great surviving treasures of the Buddhist world, the Tripitaka Koreana. More than 80,000 wooden printing blocks, each one carved by hand with the Buddhist scriptures in the 13th century. Think about what that means. 80,000 blocks of birch and wild cherry carved over 16 years with more than 50 million characters and almost no errors across the entire set. They were made as a prayer, an act of devotion offered up in the hope of protecting the kingdom from invasion. And here is the part that defies easy belief. They are still here. 750 years later, the wood has not rotted, warped, or been eaten through. The monks who built the storage hall understood ventilation and humidity so precisely, the placement of the windows, the charcoal and clay and salt packed beneath the floor, that the building has preserved the blocks better than any modern climate-controlled vault has managed to match. A wooden library, older than most countries, kept whole by the knowledge of people who have been dead for centuries. The miracle of the Han River is loud and recent. This is the other Korea, the one that knows how to make a thing last. That same patience lives in something far humbler, in the way Koreans make food. For centuries, surviving the long winter meant fermentation. Cabbage, salted and spiced and packed into earthenware jars to keep until spring, became kimchi. Soybeans, pressed and aged, became the pastes and sauces beneath nearly every meal. None of it is fast. All of it is a bet on the future. Food made now to be eaten in a season that has not yet come. Once a year, families and neighbors still gather to make the winter kimchi together. Dozens of hands work through mountains of cabbage in a single weekend, and the harvest is divided among everyone who helped. The tradition has a name, Gimjang, and the world has recognized it as a piece of living heritage. In a country racing toward the future at every other hour of the day, the kitchen is where it still keeps time with the seasons and with the dead, whose recipes it refuses to forget. To find where the country itself began again, you have to go to its southern edge, to the port of Busan. During the war, as the North's armies swept down the peninsula, Busan was the last corner that did not fall. The whole surviving government and a flood of refugees were pressed into a small perimeter around the port, the final foothold. People lived in shacks on the hillsides, packed so tight that the slopes became cities of tin and cardboard. The war had nearly ended the South in its first months. The North's tanks took Seoul in 3 days and drove almost to the sea, until only that perimeter around Busan held. Then, in September of 1950, a single gamble turned the whole war over. A risky, amphibious landing far behind the lines at Incheon, on tides so extreme, most planners had called it impossible. The front lurched north, then south again, then settled, after 3 years, almost exactly where it began, on a line near the 38th parallel, with millions dead and a country cut in two. The cruelest arithmetic of that line was the families. When the border froze, it froze with brothers, parents, and children on opposite sides. And it did not thaw. For decades, the two states held rare, tightly controlled reunions. Elderly people would meet a sibling they had last seen as a child, for a few hours, once, before being separated again, this time by age and death rather than by war. Most never got even that. There are people in Seoul today who still do not know whether the relatives they left behind in 1950 ever grew old. Those hillside neighborhoods are still there, painted now in bright colors, a tourist draw. Busan today is the country's second city and the home of one of Asia's most important film festivals. The harbor that once held desperate refugees now handles some of the heaviest container traffic in the world. And to the north, always to the north, there is the other half of the same people. The same language, the same ancestors, the same food, split by a line drawn in a hurry in 1945 and frozen by the war. 70 years on, the two Koreas have become so different that they can barely understand each other's slang. One built the miracle, the other did not. They remain the clearest natural experiment in modern history about what choices do to a nation. The line that divides them is the most heavily armed border on Earth, and it is also, against every expectation, the wildest place in the country. The demilitarized zone is a strip of land about 250 kilometers long and 4 kilometers wide, running coast to coast across the peninsula. It is sown with mines. It is watched by guns. For more than 70 years, almost no human being has set foot in most of it. And in that absence, the land did what land does when we leave it alone. It came back to life. Nearly 6,000 species of wild plants and animals now live in and around the zone. Of the 267 species South Korea classifies as endangered, more than 100, 38% of them, survive here, in the gap between two armies. The Siberian musk deer, the Asiatic black bear, the leopard cat, the Korean goral, a shy mountain goat antelope that picks its way along cliffs where no soldier can follow. But the creatures the zone is known for arrive on the wind. Each winter, in the wetlands near Cheowan, the cranes come down out of the northern sky. Red-crowned cranes and white-naped cranes, among the rarest birds on the planet, descend onto the frozen rice paddies inside the buffer to feed and rest. Before dawn, thousands of birds lift off the ice at once, and the sound of their wings rolls across a no-man's land laid with explosives. In Korean art and poetry, the crane has always stood for peace and long life. And here is the contradiction the whole zone is built on. The deadliest border in the world has become the safest home these birds have left. Their survival depends on the two Koreas continuing to refuse each other, which means peace if it ever comes, is the thing that could destroy them. The moment the soldiers leave, the developers arrive. The cranes are sheltered by the standoff. We have not yet had to choose between them and the peace. The cranes will be back at the end of this story. For now, hold the image. Thousands of white birds rising over a minefield. Remember the cranes. Because while the wild was quietly reclaiming the border, the people were learning, slowly and at great cost, how to reclaim themselves. When Park Chung-hee was assassinated in 1979, there was a brief, hopeful spring. People believed democracy was finally coming. Instead, another general moved in. Chun Do-hwan seized control of the military in a coup, and when the country protested, he declared martial law. In the southwestern city of Gwangju, the people refused to accept it. It is the 18th of May, 1980. Students gather to protest the closing of their universities. Chun sends in elite airborne troops, and the soldiers do not use restraint. They beat protesters in the streets. They beat bystanders. The brutality is so open, so public, that the city itself rises. Not just students now, but workers, shopkeepers, taxi drivers, parents. For 6 days, the citizens of Gwangju drive the army out and hold their own city. They organize, they share food, they bury their dead. Nearly 250,000 people take part. And then, on the 27th of May, the tanks come back in before dawn, and the army retakes the city by force. The official death toll was put in the low hundreds. Many in Gwangju have always believed the true number was far higher, and the argument over those numbers has never fully ended. What is not in dispute is what happened. A government turned its own army on its own citizens for demanding the right to vote. The regime called the dead rioters and communists. It would take years and more struggle before the country could call them what they were. Among the people the dictatorship marked for destruction was a politician from the Gwangju region named Kim Dae-jung. He had already survived a kidnapping and a faked drowning at sea. After Gwangju, the regime put him on trial, blamed him for the uprising, and sentenced him to death. He was not executed. International pressure and his own refusal to break kept him alive. Hold his name. His story is not over. The pressure built through the 1980s. John Tae-il's labor movement, the memory of Gwangju, students and workers, and ordinary office clerks marching together. In 1987, the streets filled, past the point the regime could hold. The government finally agreed to direct presidential elections. The dictatorship, after a quarter century, was over. South Korea had now done something almost as improbable as the economic miracle. It had become a real democracy, not because a kind ruler granted it, but because its people took it in the street, against tanks, and paid for it in blood. The prosperity was built by command from above. The freedom was won from below. They were two different miracles, and the second one was harder. A year later, in 1988, the world came to see for itself. Seoul hosted the Summer Olympics, the coming-out party of a nation that within living memory had been a byword for poverty and war. The generals had wanted the games as a showcase for the regime. By the time the torch arrived, the regime was already giving way to the ballot box, and what the world actually watched was a young democracy introducing itself. For a country that had spent the century being defined by others, colonized, divided, fought over, it was the first time it got to stand in the open and be seen on its own terms.
And once it had been seen,
It decided to be heard. In the years around the 1997 crisis, the government made a deliberate, almost industrial decision. It would build culture itself into an export, the way it had once built ships and chips. It funded studios, training systems, the whole machinery that turns music and film into a national industry. The strategy got a name the world would eventually learn: Hallyu, the Korean wave. It worked beyond anyone's plan. A music video about a wealthy Seoul district became the first thing on the internet watched 1 billion times. A boy band and a girl group became some of the most valuable acts on the planet. Korean food, skincare, and television swept across countries that could not have found the peninsula on a map a generation before. The nation that had once begged for foreign aid was now selling the world its dreams. But the dreams it sold were not all bright ones. Underneath the wave, the country was quietly folding its own diagnosis into its most popular stories, and the world, dazzled by the surface, mostly missed it. We will come back to that. And the country began slowly to turn back and repair what the rush had broken. Run a river through the heart of Seoul and you have the Han. But there was once a smaller stream, the Cheonggyecheon, that ran through the old downtown. During the building frenzy of the 1970s, it was treated the way the whole country treated the past: paved over, buried under concrete, and topped with an elevated highway. Progress ran on top of it. The water was forgotten beneath. Then, in 2003, the city did the unthinkable. It tore the highway down. It dug the stream back up. By 2005, the Cheonggyecheon was running in daylight again through the center of Seoul, a thin green seam of water and willow where 10 lanes of traffic used to roar. A country that had spent 40 years burying its rivers under roads chose to undo one of them. It was a small thing, a few kilometers of restored stream. But it was a country pausing for the first time to ask what all the speed had cost. No one asks that question more quietly or more completely than the women of Jeju. Jeju is a volcanic island off the southern coast, built around a dormant peak and ringed by cold, hard water. And in that water work the Haenyeo, the sea women. For centuries, they have dived without air tanks, holding their breath, plunging 10 meters down to harvest abalone, sea urchin, and shellfish from the rocks. It is one of the few traditional societies on Earth built around the labor of women. The Haenyeo were the breadwinners. They dove through pregnancies and through winters. They developed a way of breathing, a sharp, whistling exhale as they surface, called sumbisori, that carries across the water like bird call, the sound of a woman trading air for the sea floor. She is 73 years old. She pulls on a wetsuit on a grey morning, walks into water cold enough to stop a younger heart, and goes under, the way she has every working day since she was a girl. She surfaces with that long, whistling breath, drops her catch in the net float, and goes down again. And when she climbs out, she looks along the rocks at the other women, and they are all, like her, old. The youngest Haenyeo are in their 50s. Most are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. Their own daughters did not follow them into the water. The daughters went to the universities the miracle built, to the offices in Seoul, to lives that do not involve drowning cold and abalone. The tradition was recognized by the world, named a treasure of human heritage. And it is ending anyway. When these women are gone, there will be no one to take their place. The sea women are not dying out because the work failed. They are dying out because the country succeeded, because it offered their granddaughters something easier, and the granddaughters took it. The Haenyeo are not really an exception. Look closely and they are the whole country in miniature. A way of life, aging, with no one behind it. Keep them in mind. We are almost there. There is one more living thing worth following before the end, and it is small, and it carries light. In the clean streams of Jeju in early summer, the fireflies rise. There are nights when the riverbanks fill with thousands of them, drifting points of cold green light over the water and into the trees. The firefly is a fragile thing. Its larvae need clean, slow water and the specific snails that live only there. When the water is poisoned, the fireflies are the first to vanish. They are a kind of living test of whether a place is healthy. For that reason, the Jeju firefly and its habitat are protected as a national treasure. During the worst of the industrial rush, the fireflies thinned out across the country as the rivers filled with the runoff of factories. Their return, where they have returned, is another of the country's quiet repairs, a sign that some of the water is clean again. A nation that built itself in concrete and smoke, learning late to make room for a creature whose only purpose is to glow. And that brings us back to gold. For 30 years, the miracle had looked unstoppable, and then, in 1997, it nearly ended in a matter of weeks. A financial crisis sweeps across Asia, beginning in Thailand in July. By November, it reaches South Korea, and the whole structure of the miracle, the chaebol fed on cheap loans, the banks stacked with debt, turns out to be far more fragile than anyone admitted. It is late 1997. Foreign lenders demand their money back all at once. The Korean won goes into free fall. Foreign investors pull around $18 billion out of the country. The national debt is over $150 billion, and the central bank's reserves have fallen below $4 billion. The country that astonished the world is, within a matter of days, on the edge of national bankruptcy. Hundreds of thousands of people lose their jobs. Companies that had promised lifetime employment collapse. The pride of the miracle generation cracks open. To survive, the government turns to the International Monetary Fund, which assembles a bailout of around $58 billion, the largest in history to that point, in exchange for harsh terms. Koreans to this day do not call it the financial crisis. They call it the IMF crisis, the way you might name a war. And here, the oldest instinct in the country comes back. It is January of 1998. The broadcaster KBS proposes something simple, almost naive. If the nation is in debt, let the people pay it down with their gold. And they do. Across the country, ordinary people line up outside collection points, holding what gold they own. They bring wedding rings. They bring the tiny gold rings given to babies on their first birthday. They bring medals, heirlooms, the jewelry of grandmothers. Athletes bring Olympic medals. 3.5 million people take part. Together, they hand over about 227 tons of gold, worth somewhere over $2 billion. It is the same act as 1907, the same instinct, 90 years later. When the nation is in danger, you reach into your own home and you give what you have. The men who quit smoking and the women who sold their rings to the Japanese in 1907 had grandchildren now lining up to do it again. The gold the people gave was, against the scale of the debt, a small fraction. But it steadied the country, and South Korea repaid the IMF years ahead of schedule. The president who led that recovery was Kim Dae-jung, the same man the dictatorship had sentenced to death after Gwangju. The dissident they could not kill became the leader who pulled the country back from bankruptcy and who reached across the border toward the north in search of peace. In 2000, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. The arc of that one life, from the death cell to the highest honor in the world, is the arc of the country itself. So the people saved the miracle again, and that is exactly where the story turns, because the very thing they used to save it is the thing now taking it apart. Step back and look at what every part of this story has in common. The workers in the textile mills, the students bent over their books past midnight, the protesters in Gwangju, the families lining up to give away their gold, the bet on education, the sacrifice of the present for the future, the willingness to give up the self for the collective. That engine, that total, relentless willingness to sacrifice now for later, is the engine that built everything. And a whole generation absorbed its lesson completely, so completely that they applied it to their own lives and arrived at a conclusion no government intended. If life is a competition this brutal, the exam, the job, the cost of an apartment in Seoul that swallows a decade of salary, the working hours among the longest in the developed world, then a rational young person looks at the arithmetic and makes a choice. Many are choosing not to marry, and of those who marry, many are choosing not to have children or to have only one. The arithmetic is not abstract. To rent in Seoul, many young couples must hand a landlord a deposit worth years of income, a lump sum the size of a small mortgage, returned only when they leave. To buy slips further out of reach with each passing year. A child means cram school fees that can rival a second rent, in a system where falling behind feels like a permanent verdict. The state has poured in cash bonuses, cheaper loans, longer leave, the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars. The money has barely moved the decision because the decision was never really about money. It was about time and risk, and whether there is any slack left in a life to give to someone smaller. And the weight does not fall evenly. South Korea has the widest gender pay gap in the developed world. A woman who steps out of the workforce to raise a child often finds the door has quietly closed behind her. The promotions gone, the experience discounted, the way back narrow. Faced with a choice between a career built over a decade and a child, the system will largely ask her to carry alone. More and more women are choosing the career or choosing themselves. They are not refusing the future. They are refusing terms they did not write. They are not failing to do what their grandparents did. They are doing exactly what their grandparents did, sacrificing the present, optimizing for survival, refusing to take on more than they can carry. The grandparents gave up their gold for the nation. The grandchildren are giving up the family for the self, because the nation taught them that the future is something you pay for in advance, and the price of a child now feels like more than a life can bear. Here is the part the world has not quite let itself see. The most beloved Korean stories of the last decade are about exactly this. The film that won the Academy Award for Best Picture, the first in a language other than English ever to do it, is a story about a poor family and a rich one, about an inequality so deep it ends in blood. The series, watched in more than 90 countries at once, is about people so crushed by debt that they will gamble their lives in children's games for a chance at relief. The world watched those stories and called them entertainment. It put them on best-of lists and dressed up as the characters for parties. But they were never only entertainment. They were a diagnosis, exported. The country was telling the world, in its most popular art, exactly what the miracle had cost, and the world was enjoying it too much to listen. The numbers are now beyond argument. South Korea has been the only developed nation with a birth rate below 1 for years. In 2015, it was 1.24. By 2023, it had fallen to 0.72, the lowest ever recorded anywhere on Earth in peacetime, lower even than nations at war. The government has spent the equivalent of more than $270 billion trying to reverse it, and for years, nothing moved. If the trend holds, the country's own statisticians project that the population will fall from 52 million toward 36 million by 2072. By 2030, 1 in 4 South Koreans will be over 65. The schools that once grounded planes for the entrance exam are closing for lack of children. Towns in the countryside are emptying. The cobra head shape of the population chart, narrow at the bottom, heavy at the top, is the shape of a society quietly running out of the young. You can already see the far end of that curve on the streets. The generation that sacrificed everything to build the miracle was, for most of its life, too busy building to save, and the promise of lifetime employment dissolved in the 1997 crisis. So today, Korea carries one of the highest rates of elderly poverty in the developed world. In a country of glass towers and the world's fastest networks, you will see men and women in their 70s and 80s pulling carts of flattened cardboard through the side streets at dawn, collecting it for a few coins a kilogram. The grandparents who once gave their gold are growing old in a country that grew rich faster than it learned how to hold them. This is the bargain coming due. A nation that bet everything on the future now has more past than future inside it, more people aging out than coming in. And the young who might have cared for the old are the same young who are choosing not to have children of their own, partly because they can already see how little the system has left for the generation just ahead of them. This is the miracle nobody outside has fully understood. Not the towers, not the songs, the cost. The world sees a country that won, and it did win. But the same fierce, sacrificial drive that lifted it out of the rubble in a single lifetime is the drive now leading its young people to decide that the race is not worth running again. So what becomes of a place like this? There is a small, fragile sign worth naming honestly. After 8 straight years of decline, the birth rate ticked up to 0.75 in 2024 to around 0.8 in 2025, as marriages rose. It is the first increase in nearly a decade. It is also still by a wide margin the lowest in the world, and far below the level that would hold the population steady. It may be the turn of a corner. It may be a pause. No one yet knows. And so we come back to the cranes. Every winter, they still descend onto the frozen wetlands of the border, thousands of them, rising at dawn over a minefield. They are sheltered by a standoff, by 2 halves of one people who cannot agree to stop being enemies. Their safety depends on a wound staying open. The same is true, in a way, of the whole country. The thing that made it strong is the thing now hollowing it out. The discipline that built the miracle is the discipline that may end it. You cannot simply remove the cost without losing the thing the cost paid for. South Korea did the impossible twice. It grew rich from nothing, and it took its freedom by force. The question it faces now is quieter than either and harder. Not how to win, but whether a people who learned to give everything for the future can find a reason to believe the future is still worth being here for. The sea women whistle their breath into the cold and go under, knowing no one will follow them. The fireflies return to the cleaner streams. The cranes lift off the ice, white against the grey, and circle a border that holds them safe only as long as it stays dangerous. A country at the height of its power and the edge of its disappearance, both true at the same time. We came here thinking we knew this place, we knew its surface. The story underneath was always the same one: a people who will sacrifice anything, and a country now waiting to see what they will choose to sacrifice next. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until the next journey, take a breath and stay a while.